Right guys, this is our final one for today. This is lesson 20, just so you have some kind of context of what's going on in my life. It is now 2021. I'm just starting doing this because it takes about 400 years for them to be airdropped to the computer, blah blah blah. Doesn't matter. We're now on lesson 20. We've got one more to go after this, which is all about conservation of ecosystems, which we will cover next week, and then we're on to topic 8. But you will notice that with this lesson, before it, there is a required practical space. We will do this required practical if we have time. Okay, we will physically do it if we have time. That being said, our time is quite short. So for now, we're going to kind of park it and maybe come back to it later. But in doing the previous lesson, lesson 18, quite intensively in terms of investigating populations, knowledge-wise, you should be okay without going to look at a named environmental factor on the distribution of a given species. Because all we'd do is go out to the field and have a look at dandelions or daisies. It'd be really dull. So anyway, let's get into lesson 20, which is all about succession. And I don't think any of you do geography, which means that this will be an entirely new topic to lots of you. And yeah, it's basically about how a bit of barren land with nothing growing on it, sort of like at the beginning of the world, how that can then develop into having this lush biodiverse situation that we've got ourselves in today. So to start with, we're going to think about where barren land is. So barren means that there's nothing growing in it, there's no soil, it's just bare. And we've got a few different areas that we can see barren land. The first is where a glacier might retreat. And we see this happening quite often, where we've got global warming and the glaciers are becoming smaller and slowly kind of basically melting away. And the glaciers retreat and they deposit rocks. So stuff that was locked up into the ice previously is now deposited and becomes a kind of a surface, if you will. Sand, which can be moved into dunes. So those big sandy hills that is moved by either wind or sea movements, and plants, animals can live in the dunes. And finally, we can get volcanic eruptions. And volcanic eruptions is kind of twofold. So the lava itself provides a land that things can live on, but also it destroys the land underneath it. And the whole idea of succession basically surrounds this question. So how can the arrival of new species impact the land? And we've got a few different ways. So the first is that the arrival of the organism can change the environment. And it can change the environment in a variety of ways. So it could make it less suitable for the species that live there already. So less suitable for the pre-existing species. It could therefore lead to an increased ability in new species to take over. So new species to colonise and take over. Remember, this is competition again. Or it could be that the new arrival of a species changes the environment for the better. Okay, so sometimes the arrival of a new organism can be beneficial, and the change in the environment results in reduced hostility. Okay, so it means that the environment is better to survive in. It means that other species are able to survive alongside maybe the pre-existing ones. And this is where we start. So we begin with some barren land. Remember, this is land that has absolutely nothing on it. And through some mechanisms, a pioneer species arrives. And in case you haven't done the keywords, a pioneer species is an organism which colonises inhospitable land. So it's able to survive in those extreme conditions. And we need to describe and explain some common properties of a pioneer species. So what are they like and why is that useful? And the first one is that they reproduce asexually. And this is really good for them because if they're a single organism, they don't need to worry about finding a mate. They can rapidly multiply, and that's going to increase the population. As well as this, the way they reproduce is through either spores or seeds that can be carried by the wind. And the utility of this is that these pioneer species, the ones that are able to survive in these barren lands, now means that they can reach isolated areas easily. So because the seeds aren't heavy, it means that the wind can just carry them into cracks between rocks, into the top of mountains, allows them to find other areas, other niches, remember, to start reproducing and developing those populations. If they reproduce by seeds, then the seeds are able to germinate quickly. And this is helpful because they don't require that dormant period and instead have a rapid increase in population because they just get straight to growing. Generally speaking, these pioneer species are photosynthetic. And if you remember back to when we did the lessons on photosynthesis, photosynthetic organisms are also known as photoautotrophs or autotrophs, depending on which way you want to say it. They make their own food from light. And that's because this is useful because in these barren lands, there is unlikely to be nutrients. It's literally just rock. But there's a high likelihood that light is available. So if they can make their own food and therefore energy through that light, then they're able to survive. Importantly, they are able to fix nitrogen. So they're going to be nitrogen fixing organisms. And this means that they can make nitrogen containing substances. So things like our nitrates, our DNA, our RNA, our ATP, we're able to make those because they can take gaseous nitrogen out of the atmosphere and convert it to usable forms. And finally, they are extremophiles, which means they are able to survive in this barren land. Okay, so generally speaking, the barren land follows significant environmental disruption. So it could be that it's following an ice age, it could be following a volcanic eruption. The atmosphere and the abiotic factors are going to be very, very variable. So the fact that they can survive in the extreme conditions means that they don't really need anything from their environment. And so what we're really interested in is how these pioneer species that we started with on the barren land can change our abiotic factors. And this purely relates to their area that they live in. So what we see with these pioneer species on the barren land is that there's weathering of the rock that they live on. And this is going to form some kind of sandy sedimental kind of substance. When, however, my sandy or sedimentary substances mix with the dead pioneer species, because, you know, circle of life, things dies, then what we end up with is the sand or soil, but now with an increased nutrient content. And just so you're aware, an example of a pioneer species might be something like lichen. Okay, so lichen we see at the beach, it's like a planty kind of thing that covers the surfaces of rocks. Those lichen will eventually get into the cracks and start wearing down the rocks, and that gives us sand normally. But when they die, those dead pioneer species will add their nutrients, much like the carbon cycle, to the sand or to the sediment, and form a very early soil. And this is called humus. Not hummus, not two M's, humus. But what this means is that now our environment is more hospitable. It's less hostile and more hospitable, which means that new organisms are able to move in and colonise. So we have pioneer species to begin with, then our primary colonisers, secondary colonisers, tertiary colonisers, and we're going to get to that in this next question. So following our early pioneer species such as lichen, suggest and explain the types of plants which may begin to populate the early ecosystem next. So as we've said, we've got our pioneer species. I'm going to put in blue underneath them the example. And then we see slightly bigger plants coming in as our primary colonisers. So this might be something like mosses. And over time, we might end up with our our third wave of organisms coming in, our secondary colonisers, as things like ferns. Okay, ferns are the big kind of leafy things that you see in all of like Jurassic Park and stuff. They've got huge leaves, deep roots. See them on beaches quite a lot. But what we see happening is that as we increase the kind of size of the organisms that live there, so lichen to mosses to ferns, the plants are increasing in size, we also see increasing erosion. Okay, and that increasing erosion is going to result in an increased depth of the soil, or that humus that we spoke about. If we have increased size of plants and they die, then we're going to have an increased nutrient capacity in our soil. And between this increased depth of soil and also more nutrients, we're going to have an increased ability of the soil to hold water. Okay, so now we've got a thick enough layer so that water can sit in the air spaces and the roots are able to grow. This in turn is going to reduce the hostility of the environment, and it's going to allow eventually those tertiary and quaternary colonisers. So if we carry on our little flow chart, tertiary or quaternary colonisers, so things like flowering plants, perhaps eventually shrubs or trees. And what we see happening is each step as we go up this succession, we call it, that's why the lesson is called succession, this phase of succession, each type of organism makes the environment better for the next organism. Obviously that also means that maybe they're less suited, so the primary colonisers are less suited to the environment than the ferns maybe, but it improves the ecosystem nonetheless. And much like we saw with predator-prey relationships, what we see with successional changes is that the introduction of animals appears after we see quite a large growth in the variety and introduction of plants. And that's because animals are only going to move in once the plants are suitable enough for them to either provide habitats or food sources. So animals only move in when plants equals habitat or food. But what is interesting is that the complexity of the animals that move into the area, that barren land, increase in complexity in the same way that the plants do. So if we see our pioneer species, which we know is our lichen, the first animals that might be in that area are things like detritus feeding mites. Feeding mites. So these super small microscopic organisms are feeding on those decaying lichen as they break down and starting to put or help put those nutrients into the soil, that early humus. Then when we get our primary colonizers, when we get things like our mosses, then we might see animals that can live in mosses moving in. So things like very small insects, maybe worms, maybe millipedes. And even in that primary or that pioneer species to primary colonizer species, you can see that the plants have developed and become a little bit more complex, and so have the animals. If we carry on up and move into our secondary, tertiary, quaternary colonizers, bear with, then what we see with the introduction of flowering plants, trees and shrubs is that suddenly we start to develop food chains. So we might end up with centipedes, which are going to prey on the insects, maybe the smaller insects. We might then see that we get butterflies, maybe moths, potentially later on even things like reptiles or mammals moving into the area. But they will only ever, sorry, let me spell mammals properly, that's embarrassing. They will only ever move into that environment if, and only if, the abiotic factors in the plants are suited to their lifestyle. The final part of succession is reaching a climax community. So far, we've had our pioneer species, and then we've started our path of primary, secondary, quaternary, or tertiary even, maybe quaternary colonizers, and we end up at a climax community. And a climax community is what happens when an ecosystem is stable. And this stability includes the communities of animals and plants that are present. Animals or plants. These animals and plants are now in equilibrium with their environment. So there's potentially symbiotic relationships. The plants or the animals are feeding each other, providing nutrients, things like that. And what we've seen is that over time, as the abiotic factors change to reduce the hostility of the environment, flowering plants eventually are introduced, which provide food sources and habitats for organisms. And suddenly, I say suddenly like this doesn't take bajillions of years. This stability is formed through complex food webs and relationships between the organisms that live there. Now, something for you guys to do, which should take potentially 5 to 10 minutes, is for you guys to describe and explain how each of these features occurs during succession. So, what happens, how does it happen, and why is it useful? So, for example, you would say the abiotic environment becomes less hostile. Describe and explain how. Well, we get the formation of that early soil, that humus. Organisms are going to die in it, so we end up with thicker soil, which is able to retain water, increase nutrient availability, and over time plants in soil provide shelter for animals from the wind. So for each of these you need to think about the plants and the animals, and we can discuss these next time I see you if you're not sure on any of them. And our final part is to look at something called secondary succession. So what we've discussed so far is primary succession. I'm going to just draw out our flowchart again in green. So we start off with our pioneer species. We've got our primary colonisers, our secondary colonisers, maybe our tertiary or quaternary colonisers, and we end up with a climax community. But sometimes something happens to our climax community. So let's say we're in a rainforest, it's a climax community, everything's nice and stable, but some timber company or something like that decides that they want to cut all of the trees down and burn the forest to the floor. Proper butthole move. But what that means then is that we end up with very few plant species there. Okay? And instead, we get this deflected period where, yes, we were at a climax community, but we have to go back to those primary, secondary and tertiary colonisers and start again. So deflected succession is where we've got that human impact that limits succession. So in this case, clearing the forest would mean that I can only get those primary species in at the beginning. But secondary succession is much quicker. So the secondary succession that I'm showing you is in the red arrows. We don't start with the pioneer species. Instead, we go back to either the primary or the secondary colonisers instead. So to put it into words, secondary succession is where land which has previously sustained life is altered. And your example is maybe kind of agricultural land clearance, or something like a forest fire. And the secondary succession, the point of it is that that cleared land is then able to be recolonised and it returns to the climax community eventually. Okay, so obviously this is going to take time, but because we're able to go straight back to that primary or secondary coloniser stage, it's going to be much quicker. So the differences are that secondary succession, I'm just going to write it as that secondary sign, and then suk is faster than primary succession. And this is basically because we've got spores and we've got seeds which already exist. in soil which is nutrient dense. So unless your agricultural company, for example, has applied loads of pesticides and everything like that on the soil and properly cleaned it, then this is going to be nutrient dense. It's going to have your nitrates in it. It's going to have phosphorus, all of that good stuff that we spoke about back in topic 5. And the final thing we need to discuss is why secondary succession is typically faster. And we've spoken about the fact that we don't start with the barren land. So I'm going to just put in here about the spores or the seeds. And this increases the speed because, increase speed because we're going to have quicker germination. The seeds don't need to be brought in, they can just start growing. And as a result, we get an increased primary, secondary or tertiary coloniser population. As well as this, if you think about forest clearance, for example, we're going to be surrounded by other areas where other organisms live already. And by this, I'm specifically focusing on the animals. Initially, though, we're not going to get anything moving in because it's completely useless area. But once we start getting those early plants growing in this cleared area, we have an area that's actually got low competition because nothing lives there yet. We've got an area that might have high resources for certain organisms. And both of these are going to be really useful for animal populations and potentially plants, because remember they're still competing for things like space and stuff, to thrive. And with that, we finish this lesson. Okay, so things that we've learned. Primary succession is what happens when you start with barren land. You need a pioneer species, something like lichen, to break down the rocks, to break apart any lava or magma, and initially deposit some organic matter into the early sediment. As the sediment, the soil becomes more nutrient dense, you get greater complexity of plants, you get greater diversity of plants that you might see, eventually resulting in a nice and stable climax community. An important thing to note is that the climax community is often not the most biodiverse. Climax communities occur when everything is stable, so that generally means that one organism has asserted itself as like the apex species or the strongest species in that habitat. So a big oak tree, for example, takes over lots of the light and means that actually the plants on the floor or on the forest floor aren't able to thrive. If, however, our climax community is cleared through human activity, perhaps a natural disaster, then you might end up with a period of secondary succession, which is much faster because we've got land that has already been grown on, so there are evidences, seeds, spores, potentially bulbs of certain flowers that already exist in a nutrient-dense soil. As well as this, you get organisms that live surrounding the area that's just been cleared that might then move in to this newly cleared area much quicker in order to access any available resources. As I've said previously, the final part of this topic, this is topic 7, is all about conservation of habitats. And that we will do on Monday. But for now, if you finish this lesson, you finish listening to me, there is the expectation that you complete the red box exercises on page 205 to 211. They need to be done. Again, I will put the stuff on Teams for you to check your answers, but these boxes provide a lot of background information, so I can see in the red box for this this topic. Sorry, there's lots more information about the different stages of succession, including climax communities and things like that. Please look over it. Hey, please. I know I'm not there to nag you, but we are so close to being done. This is the final hard push. We've got about 7 weeks, so please make sure that you're getting as much out of the lessons as possible. I'll put the answers on Teams as well, even if you're just reading the stems, so like all of the background information, and making your own notes on them, doing some form of resource to help you. That would be much appreciated. Please continue to follow the schedule for the last bits of term. Sorry, I'm just having a look now to see what we've got planned. So, your homework is the green box questions on page 198. That's from the second lesson, looking at investigating biodiversity. The red box on page 205 that I've just discussed is also a homework task, so that does need to be done. And also you need to be doing the pre-lesson tasks that are found on page 213 for the final lesson of topic 7, which is conservation of habitats. Thank you very much for your effort today. Hopefully it wasn't too tedious. As I said, pray for me dealing with my snotty child. Like and subscribe. Love you. Bye.